Hello. Welcome to tonight's bedtime story by Lucid Tales. I hope your day has been fulfilling and calm, but whether it has been soaring on updrafts or fighting through storms for you, it's time to relax now. Find somewhere comfortable, maybe your bed or a favourite armchair, and make sure you're ready for sleep. Stretch your fingers out if you can, and feel the air around you, the freedom in your skin, the little loosening that means it's time for bed. Last night we heard about how the little brown wren became the king of the birds. Tonight's story is of another king of the birds, this time decided by a battle. Here follows the Battle of the Birds. Once, a long, long time ago, on the misty highlands, the son of the King of Tethertown went to see the great Battle of the Birds, where all creatures of the air gathered, to see the sight and bring word to his father who would be the King of the Birds that year. But by the time he arrived at the field, the battle was almost over. The great, glossy black raven with its feathers shining in the bold sun had won the battle, but was under attack from a great writhing snake. The king's son drew his sword without a thought and cut off the snake's head with one blow. The raven gasped for air and thanked the king's son mightily for his aid. "In return for the kindness you have shown me, I will show you something," said the raven. "Climb up here at the root of my wings and we will fly." So the king's son climbed onto the raven's back at the root of his two wings, and they flew, glossy and black, with feathers shining under the bold sun, over 7 bens and 7 glens and 7 mountain moors. At last they slowed, and the raven circled down. "Do you see that house?" asked the raven. "In there lives a sister of mine, and she will welcome you with food and drink, a hot bath and a warm, soft bed. If she asks if you were at the Battle of the Birds, say that you were, and if she asks if you saw me there, say you did. And when morning comes, be sure to meet me again right here." And the king's son went into the house, and was welcomed in with food and drink, a hot bath and a warm, soft bed. The next morning he met the raven where they had parted, and they flew on, glossy and black, with feathers shining under the bold sun, over 7 bens and 7 glens and 7 mountain moors. They came to another house, and once again the king's son was given a royal welcome, with food and drink, a hot bath, and a warm, soft bed. The next day they once again flew on, glossy and black, feathers shining under the bold sun, over 7 more bens, 7 more glens, and 7 more mountain moors. And once again they came to a house where one of the raven's sisters welcomed the king's son with food and drink, and a hot bath, and a warm, soft bed. But on the 3rd morning, when the king's son went to meet the raven, he instead found the handsomest youth that ever he had seen, tall and willowy, glossy and black, and shining under the bold sun, with a great bundle in his hands. "Have you seen a great black raven?" asked the king's son. "I was to meet him here." "You will never see the raven again," said the youth with a broad white grin, "for I am that raven. I was placed under spells and enchantments that gave me feathers and stole my form. You have freed me, and so I am doubly indebted to you. Take this bundle and return to your home, stopping once more at each of the houses as before. Do not open the bundle until you are where you wish to live the rest of your life, no matter how curiosity bites at your heels." And the king's son took his leave of the fine, handsome youth, and set off on the long, long walk, back over bens, glens, and mountain moors, that lasted for many days and many nights. For 3 of those nights he slept once again at each of the 3 houses, and was welcomed with food and drink, a hot bath, and a warm, soft bed, and he did not untie the bundle. But as he was at last nearing his father's house, he grew lost in a deep wood, and wandering through those tangled trees it seemed as though the bundle was growing heavier and heavier, until he was so tired he had to stop and rest. As he sat in that tangled and green ancient place, he looked at that strange, heavy bundle, and his curiosity raged. At last, thinking just one glance could do no harm, he untied it to see what was inside. Immediately the bundle began to swell and unfold, growing and rearing up high, taller than the king's son, taller than the twisted trees, budding and blossoming into the grandest castle the king's son had ever seen. It had stables and kennels, gardens with every kind of herb and flower, orchards filled with every kind of fruit, and rich hives buzzing with bees and surrounded by the sticky, sweet scent of honey. The king's son stared at this beautiful place, full of wonder and regret. There was no way he could put all of this back into the bundle now that he had opened it, and this was not where he would have chosen to live had he known. Sadly, his mind turned to the pretty green hollow near his father's castle that he had always dreamed of as home. "Oh, what is all this?" A great voice shook the branches of the trees. "This is a poor place to build a house, king's son." A giant, tall and mighty, strode through the trees and cotted weeds. "I know," replied the king's son. "I did not intend this to happen, but I cannot fit it back into the bundle by myself." "What would you give me if I could put it back in the bundle for you?" asked the giant in a voice that rumbled up from the ground. "What would you ask?" said the king's son. "Your first child, when it is 7 years old," said the giant. "You will have it, should I have a child," said the king's son. In a twinkling the giant wrapped his great arms around the castle, gardens and all, and pulled and pushed and folded it back down into the bundle, and tied it neatly together once more. "Now," said the giant, "you go your road and I go mine. Don't forget your promise, king's son. If you do, be sure that I will remember." The king's son continued on his way until he found himself again, and at last came home to that pretty green hollow by his father's castle. There he untied the bundle, and once again it swelled and unfolded, growing and rearing up high, budding and blossoming into the beautiful grand palace once more. When he went in through the great door, he was greeted by a beautiful maiden, quite as beautiful as the handsome youth had been, and she said to him, "Welcome, king's son. Everything is ready for you here, if you will marry me tonight." "It's either degrees," replied the king's son, and they were indeed married that very night. Well, my lovelies, as these things happen, in time the king's son became the king, and his wife the queen, and so in time the king and his beautiful queen were blessed with a child. So happy were they that the king quite forgot his promise to the giant, or tried to, perhaps. But on the very day of the child's 7th birthday, the giant came raging and roaring up to the castle. "You have forgotten your promise, king. Bring out your son." And the king turned to his queen in anguish, but she thought quickly and dressed the cook's son in her child's finest clothes and led him out to the giant. The giant picked up the boy and walked away with him, and the king and queen breathed a sigh of relief, while the cook wept and tore out her hair unseen in the kitchens. But the giant had not gone far before he put the boy down and gave the child a rod to hold. "If your father had this rod in his hand, what would he do with it?" "He would beat the dogs and cats away from the spits and the king's meat," said the boy. "You are the son of the cook," said the giant, and picked up the boy by his ankles and smashed him against a rock. And the giant tore back to the castle, filled with rage and fury, and shouted that if the king did not send out his child, he would tear the castle apart, so that its highest stones lay scattered upon the ground. But once again the queen dressed another's child, the butler's son, in her child's fine clothes, and led him out, while the butler held back, wailed in grief. This time the giant did not go very far at all before he turned to the boy and handed him the rod. "If your father had this rod in his hand, what would he do with it?" "He would use it to chase the cats and dogs away when they would be coming near the king's glasses and bottles." "Thou art the butler's son," said the giant, and he picked up the boy by his ankles and dashed him against a rock too. And was there ever such a thundering, my dears, as when that giant returned with a belly full of rage and fire to that pretty castle? The ground shook beneath the soles of his feet, and the castle shook, and all that was within trembled. "Out with your son," demanded the giant. And this time there was nothing for it but for the king and queen to bring out their own dear child, and at last they too wept and tore their hair as the giant walked away. When the giant handed this child the rod and asked, "Had he this rod in his hand, what would your father do with it?" the child replied, "Rule the country, of course." "Thou art the king's son, and the child I came for," said the giant. "Not son, sir, but I would be." "Then son you will be, child," said the giant, and he took the boy to his house and raised him as his own. One day, many years later, when the boy had grown strong and lithe, the giant was away from home, and he wandered aimlessly, all tasks finished. The day was bright and warm, and he heard from a high window the sweetest music he ever had heard. Enchanted, he found his way to the door of that high room, and there he found the giant's youngest daughter, playing a harp. She was as beautiful as the day was long, with great brown eyes, and when she smiled at him, he felt the sun shine brighter. "Welcome, king's son," said the girl. "I have something I must tell to you. Tomorrow my father will offer you the choice of my 2 sisters to marry, but you must refuse them and say you will only have me. My father wills me to marry the son of the king of Green City, but I will not have him." And the next day all happened as the girl said. The giant introduced the king's son to his 3 daughters and said, "Son of the King of Tethertown, you have lived here for many a year, and I have raised you well. You will not lose by having lived here for so long. You may have either of my 2 elder daughters, if she agrees, to marry, and she will go home with you the day after the wedding." But the king's son would not have either of the 2 elder girls, but looked directly at the youngest and said, "If you will give me this pretty one to marry, I would be very happy." And the giant filled with hot anger. "Before you can have my youngest daughter, you must do 3 tasks for me, and if you fail, I will have your blood for wine." "What must I do?" asked the boy, unafraid. "First you will clean my cattle shed," said the giant, taking him right out to the huge building. "Therein is the dung of 100 cattle," said the giant. "It has not been cleaned for 7 long years. I go forth from home today, and if you have not cleaned it so well that a golden apple may run from end to end without picking up a speck of dirt by the time I get home, then you will not have my daughter, and I will drink your blood to quench my thirst this night." The king's son started immediately, hauling great wagon loads of manure out of the byre, but he might as well have tried to bail out the ocean. By the time the sun had reached the arc of midday, he was half blind with sweat, and the byre looked no cleaner. The youngest daughter came to him. "You are being punished, king's son." "I am," he replied. "Come here and rest a while," she said, and as he had no hope of cleaning the byre whatever he did as she said. Soon, drowsy from warmth and work, he fell asleep, and when he woke up, the giant's footsteps were shaking the ground beneath him. The giant's daughter was nowhere to be seen, but the byre was indeed so clean that a golden apple could run from end to end without picking up a speck of dirt. "Have you cleaned the byre, king's son?" asked the giant. "I have," said the boy. "Somebody cleaned it," said the giant. "Well, it was not you," said the king's son. "As you have worked so hard today," said the giant, "you can work even harder tomorrow. You will thatch this byre with the feathers of birds, and no two feathers may be the same shade." Well, my friends, the king's son was out before dawn with his bow and arrows, but by the time the sun was high in the sky he had shot only 2 blackbirds whose feathers were all the same shade. "Come and rest a while," said the youngest daughter. "I might as well," said the king's son. "I will be dead whatever I do." And once again, drowsy from warmth and work, he fell asleep. When he awoke, the giant's youngest daughter was nowhere to be seen, and the byre was thatched with feathers, every one a different shade. When the giant came home, he said, "And have you thatched the byre, king's son?" "Yes, I have thatched it," said the boy. "Somebody thatched it," said the giant. "Well, it was not you," said the king's son. "Well, as you have done so well today," said the giant, "we will see how you fare tomorrow. There is a fir tree down by the loch, and at the top of that tree there is a magpie's nest, and in that nest are 5 eggs. You must get them for me for my breakfast, and not a single one must be burst or broken." Well, my dears, early the next morning the king's son went out to climb the fir tree by the loch, but the very first branch was 500 feet off the ground. He walked around the tree and tried to climb, but could keep no grip. "You are hurting your hands and feet," said the giant's youngest daughter. "I am," said the boy. "I am no sooner up than down." "This is no time to give up," said the youngest daughter, and she pulled off every one of her fingers and stuck them in the tree to make a ladder. "Now hurry," she said. "I can feel my father's breath hot on my back." The king's son climbed up and collected the eggs, but in his hurry on the way down he forgot to remove her little finger, left hanging at the top of the tree. "Take the eggs to my father," said the youngest daughter. "Tonight you will have your chance to marry me, if you can recognize me. My 2 sisters and I will be dressed alike and look alike, but you will know me if you love me." The king's son took the eggs to the giant, and the giant told him to make himself ready to be married. There was feasting and dancing and celebrating all through that day and into the night. The giant's house shook from top to bottom with music and laughter. At last the giant said, "Now, son of the King of Tethertown, you must choose your bride." The 3 daughters appeared, all dressed alike and looking alike so that there was no way to tell them apart. But the king's son remembered that he had lost the youngest daughter's little finger, and when he glanced at their hands he saw one of them was missing hers, so he caught her by the hand. They went to the bridal chamber to rest, but the giant's daughter said, "Sleep not, king's son. We must flee ere dawn, or my father will surely kill you. I have a trick that will delay that old hero." And she took an apple and cut it into 9 pieces, placing 2 at the head of the bed, 2 at the foot of the bed, 2 at the door to the chamber, 2 by the door of the house, and 1 alone by the stable door. She and the king's son jumped up on the back of a blue-grey filly and took off into the night. "Are you asleep?" called the giant. "Not yet," called back the 2 pieces of apple at the head of the bed. Some time later he called again. "Are you asleep?" "Not yet," cried the apple by the foot of the bed. Once again he called, and the apples by the bedroom door answered, then the door of the house. And he said, "You are going far away, daughter." And the 1 piece of apple by the stable door replied, "Not yet." And so he knew he had been tricked. At the mouth of the day, the giant's daughter felt her father's breath hot upon her back. "Put your hand in the filly's ear, king's son," and throw behind us whatever you find." And so the king's son put his hand in the filly's ear and pulled out a sloe twig and threw it behind. In a twinkling, 20 miles of blackthorn wood stretched out behind them, so thick that a weasel could barely slink through. The giant ran headlong into it and soon was cut by the thorns. "My own daughter's tricks try me," said the giant, "but if I had my axe and wood knife I would make short work of this." And he went home for the axe and the wood knife, and was not long making a way through the blackthorn. "I will leave the axe and the wood knife here till I return," said he. "If thou leave them," said a hoodie in a tree, "we will steal them." "I will set them home," said the giant. He returned and left them at the house. At the heat of the day, the giant's daughter felt her father's breath burning her back. "Put thy finger into the filly's ear and throw behind whatever you find." The king's son got a splinter of grey stone, and in a twinkling there were 20 miles of great grey rock behind them. The giant came headlong, but past the rock he could not go. "The tricks of my daughter are the hardest things that ever met me," said the giant. "But if I had my lever and mattock I would make short work of this." And he went home for the lever and mattock, and was not long making a road through the rock. "I will leave the tools here," said the giant. "If thou leave them," said the hoodie, "we will steal them." "Do that if thou wilt, there is no time to go back." At the mouth of the night, the giant's daughter once more felt her father's breath burning her back. "Look in the filly's ear, king's son, or else we are lost." He did so, and it was a bladder of water that he found. He threw it behind him, and in a twinkling there was a freshwater loch, 20 miles wide and 20 miles long and 20 miles deep. The giant came on, but with the speed he had on him he ran straight into the middle of the loch and went under, and he rose no more. The next morning the king's son and the giant's daughter came in sight of the king's palace, and the daughter kissed the son and said, "I will await you. Go in first and tell your father what has happened, and about me. But do not let any man or creature kiss you, for if you do you will forget all about me as though we never did meet." But as the king's son entered the castle, an old greyhound who had known him as a child leaped up to greet him and kissed his face, and he forgot all about her. The giant's daughter waited long for the king's son, and as the night fell she climbed into a tree for shelter, but still he did not come. The next morning a woman, the wife of a shoemaker, came for the water in the well beneath that tree, and caught sight of the giant's daughter's reflection and startled, thinking it was her own. She went home in a befuddlement, and soon her daughter came, and she too returned confused and strange. In time they returned with the shoemaker to find the reason for their suddenly strange reflections, and welcomed the giant's daughter into their poor home, and shared what little they had with her. Over the coming days, gentlemen arrived at the shoemaker's house to have shoes made for them, for the king's son was to be married. They caught sight of the beautiful giant's daughter and spoke to the shoemaker of marrying her, but he said he was not her father and had nothing to do with her. But the giant's daughter, canny and quick, invited the gentlemen back, one at a time, to play a fine trick. She told each in turn that she would marry him, and that they should give the shoemaker £100 as tocher, but each one as they went to bed she asked to check that the door was latched, or for a cup of water, or to close the shutter, and upon touching it, their hands became stuck fast to the latch, or the pitcher, or the shutter, and so they could not come to bed with her all night. On the morning of the king's son's marriage, the giant's daughter gave the shoemaker a sporran of gold from her tricks on the young gentleman, as thanks for his kindness, and made her way to the palace with him to present the shoes, and, perhaps, to get a glimpse of the king's son before he married. When they arrived at the palace, the gentles there saw what a pretty woman was at the palace gate, and invited her to take wine with them in the great wedding room. The king's son filled her a fine glass with wine, and as she went to drink, a flame leapt up from the glass, and out of it flew a golden pigeon and a silver pigeon that flew about the room. As they flew, 3 grains of barley fell on the floor, and the silver pigeon swooped down and gobbled them up. "If thou remembered when I cleaned the byre, thou wouldst not eat without giving me a share," said the golden pigeon. Again fell 3 grains of barley, and again the silver pigeon sprang and ate them. "If thou remembered when I thatched the byre, thou wouldst not eat without giving me my share," said the golden pigeon. 3 more grains fell, and again the silver pigeon swallowed every one. "If thou remembered when I harried the magpie's nest, thou wouldst not eat without giving me my share," said the golden pigeon. "I lost my little finger for you, and it is missing still." The giant's daughter held out her hand then, and the king's son clasped it in his, remembering then who it was he had got. He leapt to her side and kissed her from hand to mouth, and when the priest came they married a second time. In due course they became the king and queen of Tethertown, and never again did any son of the king of Tethertown go to witness the battle of the birds. Good night. Sleep well, and I will see you tomorrow for another bedtime story.